within the realm of the possible. Our guest is Dr. Michael Oren, a distinguished scholar with a senior fellow at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem. His education was at Columbia and Princeton. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree, a Master of Arts degree in International Affairs, and a certificate from the Middle East Institute at Columbia. And he received his Master of Arts degree and his PhD degree in Middle Eastern history from Princeton. He's received fellowships from the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the Canadian and British governments. And he served as a fellow both at Hebrew University in Israel and Tel Aviv University. And as I say, he presently is heading the Middle East History Project at the Shalem Center. As some of you know and remember, he's the author of numerous publications, but particularly relevant to this evening are his book-length treatments of diplomatic history, the first being a recounting of the Second Arab-Israeli War and its origins, subtitled Egypt, Israel, and the Great Powers, 1952 to 1956. And then, of course, his most recent book, recently published, which is on sale here, and which he'll be delighted to sign for you, if you'd like, which is entitled 6 Days of War, June 1967, and the origins of the making of the modern Middle East. The topic is fascinating, as is attested by the fact that so many of you are here. We're delighted to see you, and it's my great pleasure to present Dr. Michael Oren.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you all so much for having me here this evening. This is actually my first visit to the city of Baltimore. It's a city I mentioned earlier that I have known solely through the productions of Barry Levinson. I probably will be doing myself a disservice by saying that I'm a long-time fan of Homicide. Recognize some scenes on the dock, though. And it may also surprise you to hear that I approached tonight's topic with some trepidation. That may sound strange coming from someone who has just stepped off the plane from Jerusalem. Frank mentioned that though I am an historian, he wanted me to address the current situation in the Middle East and to make some predictions about possible outcomes in the future. And my response to him was that as an historian, I have enough difficulty predicting the past. Predicting the future in the Middle East is a difficult job, as anybody knows who's read the Bible. But I'll certainly try. Now, having said that, let me begin with a scenario that may seem familiar to some of you, if not most of you. Imagine a Middle East in the aftermath of a violent military struggle from which the state of Israel has emerged victorious. The Israelis, though confident and proud of their military prowess, are tired of terror and of bearing the cost of fighting that terror, and each one of them is willing to make great sacrifices for peace. Arab leaders who have lost this war are afraid of yet future defeats and afraid of the internal dissent that such bloodshed could unleash. And as such, they are for the first time open to compromise. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are fed up with occupation, fed up with oppression, and they look forward to determining their future freely within the context of an independent and sovereign state. And then the United States. Now, the United States is already deeply engaged in a military commitment in the East against an implacable global enemy. Yet American leaders sense the uniqueness of this moment in the Middle East, and they try to focus their energies toward achieving a breakthrough in Arab-Israeli diplomacy. Sound familiar? Sound like current history? Well, it's not. It's ancient history from 35 years ago. This was precisely the situation that obtained in the Middle East in the immediate aftermath of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, or as it is often called in the West, the 6-Day War. The Israelis at the time were indeed confident after the whirlwind victory in that contest, but they were also war-weary. Less than 2 weeks after the ceasefire, on June 19th, the Israeli government met at a top-secret session and decided to return all of the recently captured Sinai Peninsula and all of the recently conquered Golan Heights to Egypt and to Syria, respectively, in return for full peace treaties with them. They also began a secret project to explore the possibility of establishing an autonomous Palestinian entity in the West Bank, leading potentially to an independent Palestinian state. This is in 1967. Leaders of the Arab states at the time had also had their fill of war. They realized finally that Israel could not be annihilated by force of arms and admitted that a political solution, and that was the euphemism they used, a political solution had become unavoidable. Palestinian notables in the territories expressed eagerness to accept Israel's offer of autonomy and eventual independence and to live side by side in peace and security with the Jewish state. And then the United States, well before the guns fell silent in the Middle East, on the very first day of the war even, on June 5th, American officials of the Johnson administration began working to establish a new basis for Middle East mediation based on the principles of territory for peace and the rights of all states in the region to live in peace within secure and defensible borders. Those principles would be enshrined 6 months later, in November 1967, in UN Security Resolution 242. The 1967 war created unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic progress. But within a year, most of those opportunities were lost. By early 1968 rather, many of you will remember, there was a Tet offensive in Vietnam. The Johnson administration was too preoccupied with the situation in Southeast Asia to devote further energy to the Middle East crisis. And you may recall that shortly thereafter, Johnson announced that he would not seek re-elections. Arab leaders, for all their secret interest in a settlement, lacked the political legitimacy to say so openly. The result, rather, was the notorious 3 no's enacted at the Khartoum conference that September: no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. The Palestinians, meanwhile, alas, declined Israel's offer of autonomy. 80 Palestinian notables were canvassed by Israeli intelligence officials during the summer of 1967 as to whether they'd be willing to accept this autonomy cum independence plan. Every single Palestinian notable question came back with the same answer. Yes, we want autonomy. Yes, we want independence. But if we accept an agreement with Israel at this stage, Yasser Arafat and the Al-Fatah organization will put a bullet in our heads. And it died. Finally, the Israelis, their peace offers rejected, turned to unilateral measures, and a year later, in 1968, the first of what would be many West Bank settlements was built. Thus, the parties to the Middle East conflict failed to seize that historic moment. And today, 35 years later, we in the Middle East, and even you in the United States, are dealing with the consequences of that failure. Since then, peacemaking efforts in the Middle East have fallen victim to myths, Israeli myths, Arab myths, and even American myths. After 1967, Israelis came to believe that once they had vanquished their enemy, once they had captured Arab territory, if they then showed magnanimity toward the Arabs, if they then restored captured territory, then the Arabs would accept them. Restore the land, the myth held, and that would be the end of the conflict. And this assumption, over the course of the intervening 3 decades, has proved groundless. Israel fully met the territorial demands both of Egypt and of Jordan, and while it secured treaties with both these countries, it never gained acceptance from either the Egyptian nor from the Jordanian peoples. Nor have they achieved peace in any sense of a Western sense of peace with these two countries. Rather, each day, the state-controlled presses in Egypt and Jordan vilify Israel. They vilify Jews, often referring to medieval, vicious, anti-Semitic slurs. The intellectual and journalistic associations in Jordan and Egypt boycott any connection with the Israelis. Trade is severely restricted. It's almost eliminated by Egypt, which also effectively forbids its citizens from traveling to Israel. Both Jordan and Egypt have recalled their ambassadors to Israel, and there is little sign of either of them returning in the near future. Now, as a researcher trying to investigate the Arab side in the 1967 war, a personal note, I experienced this sad situation quite personally. After one visit to Jordan, a particularly fruitful visit to Jordan, I was told by Israeli security officials that I could not go back to Jordan, that it would actually be risking my life. The Egyptians made it clear to me that I would not be welcomed in Egypt, and if I did come, that they could not guarantee my safety. The existence of the Israeli myth was even more evident on the Palestinian front. Israel was prepared to meet the stated territorial demands of the Palestinian Authority, which, according to the plans worked out in Camp David in the summer of 2001, and then developed further in the Taba talks and under the Clinton plan, the Palestinian Authority was to have received close to 97% of the West Bank, half of Jerusalem, all of the Gaza Strip, and it was even going to receive a part of sovereign Israeli territory adjacent to the Gaza Strip to make up for that 3% missing. Arafat rejected this offer, however. The issue for him was not territory per se, but the Palestinian right of return, the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the pre-1948 borders. And if that right had been exercised, it would have spelt Israel's destruction. And Israel could not accept it. Israel was not about to self-destruct. And the result was a Palestinian resort to violence that continues virtually unabated to today, certainly yesterday, with the suicide bombing in Tel Aviv. And today, I recently just spoke to my family before coming up here tonight, and there were very severe warnings about suicide attacks in Jerusalem. Again, I've been involved. I live in South Jerusalem, and we are subject to shootings on a nightly basis. I'm also still at this advanced stage a soldier in the Israeli reserves, and I have served actively in the last year and a half in combating the terrorist wave. But as a researcher, it's also frustrated my research. In my book, I very much wanted to interview Palestinian veterans of '67. I wanted to interview Arafat. And it was made clear to me that if I stepped over the border, where I live in Jerusalem is only a few hundred yards down the road, that I would not be coming back. And so I apologize for the absence of an Arafat interview in my book. The Israeli myth of conquest cum magnanimity cum peace was therefore fully debunked. The Arab leaders also subscribed to a myth that somehow by maintaining and encouraging belligerency against Israel, that they could deflect their people's demands for democracy. But those demands and the people's antagonism toward Israel proved to be mutually exclusive. Worst, denied the freedom to express themselves on any issue other than Israel. Arabs used that issue as a means for assailing their rulers. It's a complex dynamic. Thus, government-approved demonstrations held against Israel's recent military operations in the West Bank and Gaza. They were demonstrations held in major Arab capitals, in Amman, in Cairo. Those demonstrations, which were supposedly aimed at protesting the Israeli military moves, quickly escalated into anti-government riots. And Arab rulers began to fear, rightly so, as it happened, that the anti-Israeli sentiment that they themselves fomented could fan the flames of a popular rebellion. And then there was the American myth. That myth that held that once treaties were hammered out and signed by Israeli and Arab leaders, once both sides were richly paid off for doing so, then peace would eventually take root and trickle down to the general public. But instead of peace, Arab populations were fed on hatred of Israel and incitement to destroy it with holy war. and many Israelis on the other side, were led to believe that they could simultaneously build settlements and build peaceful relationships with their neighbors. American-mediated treaties, meanwhile, were revealed to be flimsy, easily violated, and widely perceived in the region as serving the interests of corrupt and oppressive regimes. Together, these myths have effectively impeded peacemaking for over 3 decades. But now, here's the good news. For the first time since 1967, an historic opportunity has again arisen to shatter those myths and to begin anew the search for peace in this troubled region. Today, as in 1967, the Israelis have concluded a military campaign, Operation Defensive Shield, the conduct of which was supported by the overwhelming majority of people in Israel. Polls now show that Israelis, though they are as determined as ever to stand up to terror, are now more than ever willing to make the sacrifices necessary for peace. I mentioned before that I serve actively in the reserves. I actually have a son now in a combat unit, a frontline combat unit, and I can tell you that both in the reserves and among the standing regular army, there is no deep commitment to defend far-flung settlements whose strategic value is of questionable value. It's questionable. Arab leaders now realize that the conflict is too destabilizing to the regimes, too threatening. And though they will almost certainly resist further efforts at democratization, they know that a solution to their conflict with Israel is essential to their political, if not their physical, survival. The most important development, and I think this is truly a development of historic proportions, is occurring among the Palestinians. In their grassroots demand for political reform within the Palestinian Authority and for real democracy. If and when these demands are met, the results will reverberate throughout the Arab world. The Arab world will never be the same again. And then there is the United States. The Bush administration, after hoping to concentrate on its own conflict in the East against Islamic terror, now realizes that it cannot ignore the Arab-Israeli conflict and must become actively and effectively engaged in securing a solution. That solution, however, and there's the bad news, that solution cannot be achieved by imposing fragile agreements over a rotten core. And by rotten, I mean the despotic and often dictatorial regimes of the Middle East, including the Palestinian Authority as it is now constituted under Mr. Arafat. To impose a Palestinian state on that will not only not bring peace, but it will almost certainly lead to further violence and perhaps to regional war. Peace, rather, must be built gradually, comprehensively, and most importantly, from the bottom up. The first step is to create a climate conducive for change. This can be aided through the implementation of both the Tenet and the Mitchell plans, through the adoption of concrete measures to assure against terrorism, to guarantee troop withdrawals, and a freeze on settlement building, and to institute a verifiable ceasefire. There must be an end to violent incitement in the press, on TV, and most importantly, in children's textbooks. Borders must be open for the free flow of goods and of people, and restrictions on trade and cultural exchanges must be removed. Once in place, these steps can serve as the basis for interim agreements on the creation of a Palestinian state without prejudice to its future borders and powers, and for the leasing of land by Israel to help ensure its security and its borders. The crucial stage, however, is the next stage. And this is a long and arduous process. This is the process of the democratization of the Middle East. This will entail a protracted campaign in which the United States will be the central actor, the United States offering incentives to Middle East states to adopt basic democratic institutions and principles and to penalize those that refuse. The U.S., with its tremendous influence in the Middle East, can wield that influence toward encouraging the development of a truly free press in the region and toward the preservation of basic human and civil rights. The conduct of fair and open elections in a Middle Eastern state must become the sine qua non for maintaining favorable relations between that state and America. Only at the conclusion of this process, with stability and democracy attained, can the parties begin to address the core issues of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the borders and the parameters of Palestinian sovereignty, the refugee problem, Israeli security, and finally the status of Jerusalem. Diplomacy, as Frank mentioned, this is the title of my talk, is the art of the possible. I didn't coin the phrase, it's well known. Art of the possible, not the art of the preferable, not the art of the expedient, nor of the fantastic, of the possible. And we, in America and in the Middle East, after many decades of failure and frustration, have to ask ourselves, what is possible? Clearly, there are fundamental misconceptions. I've called them myths tonight, that have informed and frustrated our peacemaking efforts up till now, but we should suffer no more illusions. There are no quick fixes. There is no peace now. There is only hard work, there is patience, and most of all, there is persistence. We must maintain, I believe, an historical perspective, and here I can revert to being an historian again, thank God, recalling that the notion that the normal state of relations between two countries is peace and not war, in the West, in Europe, is less than 200 years old. It goes back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Relatively recent innovation. And that only 60 years ago, Europeans were butchering each other by the millions. Only 10 years ago, the Europeans in Eastern and Western Europe got together and decided that democracy, not monarchy, not autocracy, was the paramount form of human governance. Only 10 years. Today, with modern technology, advanced communications, the penetration of democratic norms into the Middle East may prove speedier and more pervasive than we've ever imagined. Historically, we know democracies rarely make war on one another, and the future democracies in the Middle East will likely be no exception. We who care about peace in the Middle East, indeed peace in the entire world, must give them that chance to prove it. Thank you.
How much does the asserted position of the Likud that there can be no state west of the Jordan, Palestinian state, square or interfere with your vision of a peaceful evolution?
It doesn't in the short run. Actually, historically, the Likud has vacillated on the question of the Palestinian state. Recently, only several months ago, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who is the head of this party, has come out and said that he will accept the notion of a Palestinian state. Now, the party has come along, deeply influenced by Benjamin Netanyahu, and said that that they will not support the Palestinian state. Let me just interject a personal political perspective, and that is that the Likud, by passing that resolution, has shot itself in the foot. Because Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis who occupy the center, and we're dealing about a very wide center today, about 85% of the population, needs what is called in Hebrew a diplomatic horizon. Even if the diplomatic horizon is illusory, it needs a diplomatic horizon. And the Likud has come out and said, oh, there is no diplomatic horizon. They'll lose the elections with that. Maybe there are people who would welcome that, but the Likud has done itself a great disservice. In the long run, however, there is no necessarily fundamental conflict between what the Likud is saying and my program. My program calls for incremental steps that may take many years, or hopefully fewer years. I think at the time, if there is democracy in the world, if there is in the Middle East, if there is a popular democracy in Palestinian areas, and Palestinians come into power or come into office who say, okay, we are willing to live side by side with you and we are willing to live in peace with you, then that change in perspective will have immediate ramifications on the political spectrum in Israel itself. I'll give you just a quick historical example. At the Taba talks, all right, in the end of 2001, the beginning of 2002, the government, and I believe the Israeli government of Ehud Barak, and I believe rightly, assumed that if the Palestinians made a sincere offer of peace to end the conflict, to sign on that dotted line and say we have no more demands to you, then Israel would have brought that agreement to a popular referendum, and the referendum would have passed. It would have caused widespread civic strife, but it would have passed, and Israel would have implemented. It would have moved tens of thousands of settlers out of their homes. Palestinians do that. If they come back again a year from now, after the terror has died down, I believe the Israelis will respond the same way, and the Likud, as politicians who want to be elected, are going to have to respond to that change.
The question is, where are the leaders to fulfill your vision?
Right. Good question. It is very much the central question. Let me give you a surprising answer. All right. It is true that we have a regrettable dearth. All right. That is also grazing it. We have an absence of effective and courageous leaders in the Middle East of the ilk of Sadat, of the prominence of Hussein. This is true. But keep in mind that in their own countries, in Egypt, Sadat is not revered. And among the Palestinians of Jordan, Hussein is not revered. All right? These people, though they made courageous moves for themselves and for the regimes, did not make a transformation in their own countries. And that is one of the reasons we're in the situation that we're in today. The leaders of the future change that will bring about, perhaps, the vision that I've described to you tonight are not the Husseins and the Sadats, but they are the people in the streets. They are the people who are right now making the demands for reform within the Palestinian Authority. These are people who are not appearing on CNN every night. These are people whose names and faces you do not know. You may know them 5, 10 years down the line. All right? What is missing in the Middle East is that same building peace from the bottom up that will succeed. We're trying to impose peace from the top down. Did not. And that is, to me, the basis of my hope. It is not a vast hope, I'll admit, but it is the basis of hope. And I will reiterate that these recent calls for democratization in the Palestinian Authority is an event of monumental historical importance. Imagine if there was a democratic Palestinian state smack in the middle of the Arab world. Arab regimes would fall domino-like. I'm willing to bet on it, one after another.
Would you comment upon the economic requirements of your movement toward peace?
More to the point, she asked, how can we hope for the development of democracy if there's no economic developments? And man, we really have a chicken and egg situation here. What precedes what? It is my feeling it's probably a bit of both, but you cannot have economic development without freedom. All right? So you have to start with basic freedoms and to have true economic development. Otherwise, the economic development will be very, very superficial and short-lived. All right? I have called tonight for an incremental process that begins with ending terror, removing troops, Israeli troops, from Palestinian areas, for freeing up frozen assets in Israel, Palestinian assets. That's part of the Tenet plan. All right. This can begin to generate an environment, a climate for the beginnings of economic development, but long-term, real economic development cannot come about without the basic freedoms that are enjoyed in democratic societies.
How would Israel deal with the paradox of dealing with a fairly elected, democratically elected Arafat or
terrorist
equivalent?
It is everyone's nightmare dealing with a democratically elected terrorist. Listen, Arafat was never palatable to the vast majority of Israelis. We look at him and cringe. All right, palatability has never been the criteria upon which we base our dealings with the Palestinian people, the palatability of their leaders. We ask only one thing of their leaders, and that is that they suppress terror. They do not encourage terror. They do not incite their populations to kill Israelis and Jews, whatever they are, and we ask them that they be serious when they sit down and negotiate with us. That's not asking so much. Needless to say, if the Palestinians were to elect another freely elected terrorist leader, then the peace process will be stillborn. There will not be a process. And it won't only be Israel that will have a problem with it, the United States will have a problem with it. Maybe if Saddam Hussein were to run in Iraq tomorrow, he'd be elected as well. I think the United States would still have a problem with dealing with Saddam Hussein. Terrorist by any other name is still a terrorist nevertheless. We get into the murky esoterica of Palestinian politics here. Arafat is very much afraid by the calls for reform within his authority, and it may create a situation where Arafat will actually upgrade, enhance his support from terror. What happens when there's terror? The Israeli army responds. What happens when the Israeli army responds? The Palestinians rally around Arafat. It's the quickest route to reinforcing your political basis is to blow up some Israelis. And these are the type of dilemmas that we deal with on a daily basis. The hope is that terror attacks can be thwarted, that Israel can react in such a restrained way so that the calls for serious reform within the Palestinian Authority can take root and can be acted upon.
The question is, would you give your view of as quickly as you could, of the extraordinarily complex process of democratization and where it's going to work and what the sequence might be? How long would it take, and are you utopian?
Yes, and there's no short answer. The cases in point that you yourself mentioned were Turkey and Afghanistan, which I said had now expressed an interest in establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. The Afghan government, the newly installed Afghan government, has said that they have no quarrel with us and they're interested in having normal relationships with us. So there is, to your point, is whether democracy will advance the peace process. I emphatically believe yes. All right, that doesn't mean I'm not utopian, but I emphatically believe yes. Now, we in Israel, myth is a favorite term among historians. We've had a myth in Israel that we are the light unto nations, not only among Israelis. I think it appears in the Bible a few times. Or Lagoyim in Hebrew, a light unto nations, that somehow Israel would introduce to the Middle East modern agricultural methods, technology, high tech, and also democracies. And lo and behold, I believe that that part of our myth is not entirely mythic. We are dealing with a Palestinian population that has had one of the few populations in the Arab world that has had daily contact with a functioning and robust democracy. All right, and I can't stress the robustness of Israeli democracy. Here's a democracy that has existed under combat conditions for 54 years and has not collapsed. We've never had a non-peaceful change of government. You can't say that about the French. You can't say it about Turkey. All right? A robust democracy. You cannot live with that type of proximity to that type of freedom and not be influenced by that. You cannot live in such propinquity to liberty and then put up with a typical Middle Eastern corrupt, oppressive regime. It's just not going to hold. I think Arafat knows that too. And go back to an earlier question, I think there are young people who are graduates even of Israeli universities who are not going to put up with this in the long run. And I think that's why it will happen in Palestine first. And I think there's even a historic justice in it.
The questioner asks, how do you cope with an endless stream of demagogues among the Middle Eastern states?
Just through it's a process. I have to reiterate what I said in my remarks, and I apologize for sounding repetitive, that this is a process that may take many years. It is a process which I believe in the long run is unavoidable. It is a process, you can't stop the flow of information today. You can't stop the percolation of modern ideas through these societies, no matter how much they try. The Syrians have been trying to stop internet for years and they're not succeeding. And that it will not take overnight, but it is an inexorable situation, I believe. And it's true that you have the son of Hafez al-Assad in Syria, and the son of Hussein in Jordan, and many sons of Faisal in Saudi Arabia. But I'm willing to gamble that 50 years down the line, you will not see their sons in power in these countries. I want to say also that I do agree with you, and I regretfully agree with you, that all of America's successes in the peace process, all right, have been tainted in the popular view because they were made with undemocratic leaders. All right? The United States made a breakthrough at Camp David under the Carter administration with Sadat, with Anwar Sadat. I mentioned earlier that he was not a revered figure in Egypt at the time, certainly not now. And the United States paid a lot of money for that agreement. A priori, that agreement is suspect and tainted in the popular Arab vision because it was made with a despotic ruler. The same thing would happen in the West. If some dictator made a treaty, people would not respect it very much. This is why peace has to be made from the bottom up.
To what extent is the conflict religiously based? And to that extent, does true peace become impossible?
It's a tough question, because the same people who reject a Jewish state, who view as abominable a gross distortion in the proper order of the universe, the existence of a Jewish state in the Arabic heartland, ultimately will reject the modernity and liberty and freedom of American civilization as well. And with these people, there is a long, protracted conflict. I believe that the democratization process will be accompanied, again, this is a long-term process, with the reformation of Islam, which is the only true cure for the problem of Islamic extremism. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. I can't stress this enough. The process has to be internal. It can't be imposed. We can, in America, can bomb Afghanistan back to the Jurassic Age, okay? But until there is a movement, an impulse within Islam to explore these problems, the sources of Islamic extremism, the origins of an al-Qaeda organization, until there is such a movement, then the problem is not going to go away.
Would you speak to the concept of building fences, maybe not literally, around Palestinian, around the settlements on the West Bank and between Israel and Palestine?
The Secretary said it
Right.
frequently, and that's what he meant, and many Israelis, I understand,
Right. Yeah, National Public Radio last week scoured the state of Israel looking for somebody who was against the building of a fence. They found me. You're looking at the one Israeli who's against. No. I'm against the building of a fence, not because good fences make, high fences make good neighbors, because I don't see much efficacy in it. There is a short-term benefit of perhaps frustrating some terrorist activity. Okay, so you build a few barriers. All right. But to view a fence as the panacea of all of our problems with the Palestinians and beyond them with the Arab world is delusional. And the fence could actually promote the next war rather than prevent or even delay it. Because the minute you build that fence, if you build a wall, you're going to have the Iraqi army up against the other side of that wall. All right? And those people who pressed for an immediate Israeli evacuation from Lebanon with the justification that, oh, if they shoot at us, we can shoot back, we now found that we can't shoot back so easily. That every time we shoot back at them, we trigger an international crisis and the world condemns us. What's going to be happening when they're not firing from southern Lebanon, but firing from Ramallah and Bethlehem? What if they set up an artillery piece in the courtyard of the Nativity of Manger Square? All right? To give you one example, we see how sensitive that area is. The wall could just as easily complicate it and impede our efforts to combat terror. Some type of separation among barriers, okay. But a wall, I don't buy it.
Would you comment upon Saddam Hussein's influence on the Arab-Israeli conflict and America's response to that creation?
I'm privileged to have been one of the few Israeli veterans of the Gulf War. When the Gulf War broke out I was a reserve officer. I was assigned to be the strategic liaison officer with the 6th Fleet. And one of our functions was to bring in the Patriot missiles. And I was a liaison actually between then Secretary of Defense Cheney and Israel's Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense, Moshe Aarons. The night that the Patriots were brought in January 1991, thousands of Israeli troops were on the runway preparing to invade western Iraq. We were within hours of a major Israeli invasion of western Iraq to look for the Scud missiles, because Israel had taken 21 Scud hits and hadn't reacted. And Israel, in addition to the physical destruction and the morale, the blow to Israeli morale, there was a whole question of our entire deterrence power collapsing. Israel at that time agreed not to attack western Iraq and to accept the Patriot missiles, which didn't work, actually, but it did help restore Israeli morale and show that the United States was willing to make that gesture. That will never happen again. All right? If the United States invades Iraq, almost axiomatically, Iraq will fire Scud missiles, perhaps this time with non-conventional warheads, into Israel, and Israel will react. And we will react forcibly, and we will act massively. Okay? I will sign on that. Having said that, then will come the crux of the situation. How will the Arab world react? Because Saddam Hussein will be firing missiles into Israel in order to drag the entire Arab world into war, all right, against Israel and ultimately against the United States. And then you get into a very complicated dynamic of what's going to happen internally in the Arab world. I assume that American policymakers who are determining their next steps in the Middle East and the anti-terror campaign will take that crucial dynamic into consideration.
Can you create a Palestinian democratic state without either the help, encouragement, or already prior existence in other Arab states?
Excellent question. I think that the Palestinian state would be in grievous danger in its nascent stage of subversion from neighboring Arab states, and the United States would have a pivotal role in assuring the security of that state. Israel, and I say this with great regret, Israel had a role in assuring, in aiding and abetting the suppression of democratic forces in the West Bank and Gaza. In the Oslo Accords, and again, I want to refer to my personal appearance. I was an advisor in the early Rabin government and during the early Oslo period, and I saw this firsthand. The notion was, we have done all we can as a democratic regime to suppress Hamas. What we really need is a thug who is not bound by the same democratic Western type, we observe the law type of rules. Bring him in and he'll do our dirty work for us. Who did we find? Yasser Arafat. Didn't do the dirty work for us, he did the dirty work against us. And it's not a particularly proud chapter in Israeli history. We could have done, I think, more to promote these democratic forces, these terribly beleaguered democratic minded forces in the area. Now we have a second chance. Now I think it's problematic for a Palestinian to accept the security and safeguards from the Israelis, because they will immediately concede or forfeit their legitimacy in Palestinian eyes. This is why I think it's not Israel that can do it, but the United States can do a tremendous amount.
The question is, how would you envision the refugee problem being resolved?
There is an ineluctable solution to the Palestinian problems the refugee problems that everybody knows, but not everybody is willing to sign on just yet. And that is a combination of a symbolic repatriation with massive compensation toward the goal of resettlement. This has been American policy going back to the late 40s. This has actually been Israeli, at least secretly, Israel's policy going back to the late 40s. 1949, Israel offered to resettle 100,000 refugees and to compensate the rest. Now Israel, in Taba, they were willing to repatriate less, actually. It has to be a regional solution. It cannot be a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian solution, because there's no solution there. You have 300,000 refugees in Lebanon. You have another 200,000 plus in Syria. without the cooperation of these countries in a this is why I stress the word comprehensive in my talk, there is no solution for the refugee problem. The package, by the way, for compensation offered at Camp David was estimated to be $30 billion.
The question, does peace require total victory in a war, as is asserted Mr. Netanyahu believes?
I don't recall that quote, and I don't agree with it. I do, however, think that that peacemaking requires deterrence, because we are dealing in a rather hazardous area of the world, and it is important that those who oppose peace and who would oppose peace through violence know that they will pay for those actions multifold, all right? And therefore, the military aspect of it is very important. It's not negligible.
Did Israel consciously and knowingly attack the Liberty?
It's fascinating to me the degree to which the Liberty incident remains so much in headlines, so much in people's interest. I was interviewed again by National Public Radio last week on a call-in show, and 90% of my call-in questions related to the USS Liberty. For those of you who don't know, the USS Liberty was an American spy ship directed by the NSA that appeared off the coast of Sinai on the third day of the war, June 8th. It was attacked by Israeli planes, then by Israeli ships. 34 American servicemen died, 171 were wounded. Israel apologized for the attack. It paid compensation for the attack. It called off the attack the minute the Israelis knew what they were shooting, what they engaged with. They thought it was an Egyptian ship. Since then, the Liberty incident has generated just myriad books about conspiracy theories. Israel supposedly attacked the Liberty because the United States learned that Israel was planning to attack the Golan Heights, because Israel was cooking messages between Egypt and Jordan in order to drag Jordan into the war. And most recently in James Banford's book about Israel supposedly was committing atrocities in Sinai, so it committed another atrocity against its only ally in the world at a time when the Soviet Union was threatening to intervene militarily. In my book, in my research, I have viewed all of the many hundreds of documents, both Israeli and American, on the USS Liberty. Almost all of them are declassified. There are 3 official Israeli reports. There's a U.S. naval report. There are the actual communications with the U.S. Liberty. There is now the evidence of a U.S. spy plane, which was over the Liberty at the time of the attack. All of these documents prove categorically, conclusively, that there was no conspiracy to attack the Liberty. The Liberty attack was the result of a concatenation of mistakes, both on the American and the Israeli side. And these things happen in battle. I was telling someone earlier before that my father's a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, and I recall that in the town of Malmedy in Belgium was bombed 3 times by the U.S. Air Force after its liberation, and with hundreds of casualties. And myself as a soldier, have been shot at almost as many times by the Israeli Air Force as I have by enemy air forces, often with ruinous results. I would refer you to an exchange on the Bamford issue that I had in the New Republic last July. There is also an article published in the Shalem journal, Azure, called USS Liberty Case Closed. And there's the chapter in my book that deals extensively. It is the fullest analysis and revelation of the Liberty material. All of these articles are available at michaeloren.com.
What is the role of international organizations and international forces in trying to solve the problem?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, in our area of the world, and particularly from the Israeli perspective, international organizational intervention in the Middle East has not been a factor for peace. It's been a factor more often than not for heightened strife. Israel historically has had a problematic relations with the UN for the simple reason that the UN is made up of constituent members, and those constituent members are not all, a majority of them don't necessarily have good relations with Israel, and that is reflected in the UN's overall policy. Israel would prefer to deal with the United States. It would prefer to deal even with Russia at this point. The relationship between Europe, united Europe and Israel are at an all-time low. So much so that the Europeans really have no influence on the peace process today. Talking about shooting themselves in the foot, I talked about the Likud shooting itself in the foot. The Europeans have shot themselves in both feet in terms of the Middle East peace process. It's very sad. They had something serious to contribute there. I would not look toward the international organizations as heralding the redemption of the Middle East from conflict. I would look much more to American diplomacy, American influence, American mediation.
The question was comment on whether what you think of the observation that it'll be a quarter of a century before the Palestinians are ready to compromise.
Yeah, I disagree. Not because I am Pollyannish. I'm not a wide-eyed optimist. It boils down to the fact that we can't survive that long, neither of us, in the present situation. The present situation is intolerable. All right, Ehud Barak, and I would agree with something that Ehud Barak said in his last weeks in government, that this is a war of attrition. The first side that yells "uncle" is going to win. In certain ways, the Palestinians have already yelled "uncle." The call for reforms in the Palestinian Authority is the uncle. Okay? It's people saying, we don't have to suffer like this. We don't have to have our neighborhoods bulldozed over. We don't have to lose our jobs. We don't have to be stuck at checkpoints for 4 hours. All you have to do is accept what the Israelis offered you at Taba, and this all goes away. All right? They're not stupid, these people. They understand this. And to me, it can't go on. Maybe another year, maybe 2 or 3 years, but 25 years. No, I think that is fatalistic.
Does the Middle East have a cultural heritage conducive to the creation of democracy as perhaps the West does?
Well, a Muslim scholar would answer you yes, that in Islam there's the concept of ijtihad, of people arriving at consensus on important religious issues. There are notions of democratic institutions in Islam, but no, Islam has not gone through the Reformation. It hasn't gone through the Enlightenment. The Middle East in general hasn't gone through these stages. However, I will go back to what I said, that time and history is telescoping. It's telescoping because of the advent of modern technology. Things happen at a more rapid pace than they did in the past, and vastly more rapid than they did in the past. And so a 25-year span of time, even that to me seems like a long time for these events to transpire. I would give you just an example of the Jewish people. You know, Judaism doesn't have any great history of democracy either. All right, and what happened in the state of Israel was basically two things. One, that Jews, especially from Central and Western Europe, had long-term exposure to democracy. All right? They went to the Enlightenment. All right? Keep in mind what I said earlier about the Palestinians being exposed to Israeli democracy, and also because they reached the land of Israel, and they found they couldn't get anything done unless they had a consensual agreement about it, and no one could truly impose his beliefs. So democracy was really the easiest way to get things done, the most effective way to get things done, and I cannot stress how strong Israeli democracy is as a result of that. So even the absence of a long history of democratic development and institutions is not as large as an impediment as you might think to the development of democracy in the Middle East.
I have to apologize to a lot of you who still have questions. It is 10 after. We do have to end the period. It's been an extraordinary evening, I believe. Thank you very, very much.
Can I say one more thing? Can I, Brian? Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for making me feel it very much at home tonight by raising the temperature here to Middle Eastern levels. And thank you, so many of you, for being for reacting pessimistically to my remarks. I feel very much as if I'm in Jerusalem here, but I stand by them nevertheless. Thank you very much.